Sup YouTube? In this video we're going to be focusing on some deep and minimal house style drum design, and I wanted to really take an emphasis on sound selection and sample choices. Now, I'm sure if you've tried to produce minimal or deep house, or if this is something you've been doing for years, you've probably noticed there's not a lot of great sample packs out there for producers like us. The reason being, most sample packs are sort of geared more towards the EDM space, and even the ones that claim to be underground, they sort of miss the point on the tonality of the drums, and they give you sounds that are really hard hitting, super punchy, super over compressed, and we all know in the kinds of minimal and deep productions we love, the sounds are actually sometimes kind of soft, feel very rounded, and come together in a way that really lets the groove breathe rather than trying to hit you right in your face with all these big, bold sounds. Now, that being said, there's a lot of techniques we're going to go through in this lesson on how to tame some of those really hard sounds. But I did also want to point out that there's actually a lot of good samples that we can use right in Ableton's stock sample packs. A lot of producers overlook that Ableton has all of these extra packs you can install. Right here in the browser, you've got this pack section, and with each release, they keep putting out more and more of these. I went and downloaded all of them. There's probably like 100 of them in here. I've been through a couple over the years, and some of them are cool, some of them not as much. Some of them I find interesting uses for, but I never really had one that I was like, okay, this is actually good for the style of like deep and minimal house that I write. I had overlooked there's this pack called Punch and Tilt, and I think it was released quite a number of years ago. I remember this being here since at least Ableton 10. It's been around for a while. And the reason I'd overlooked it, you read through the description, it's like, okay, this is the most for the floor friendly pack that they have. But when you start going through the drum kits, it falls victim to exactly what I was talking about, of these really harsh, overly abrasive sounds. And you can even preview some of these. When we go through these drum kits, you'll hear what I'm talking about. These kicks are just absolutely smacking. That is not something I would use in a minimal house production. There are some interesting sort of sounds in here as you're previewing them, but what I had really overlooked was just creating my own drum kits out of these. I went through all of their prepackaged drum kits. I found that A, they were too hard, like we've talked about. B, they're not very mix ready. They're very loud, especially some of the higher end sounds like the hi-hats and the shakers and stuff. They're really harsh and not taming the top end at all and just totally crushing your mix. But under the samples folder and in the one shots, there's actually a lot of really good sounds to work with here. And some of them are even a little softer, and some of those that are a little harder, there's things you can do to process them that can make them really fit in a nice, smooth, sort of laid back style of production. So this lesson today is going to be kind of fun because I actually haven't really pre-prepared anything here. We're starting with a blank template, and I'm going to be going through the samples folder in real time, and you can watch me build a drum kit and some drum grooves. At the end of the lesson, I'm going to package these up and I'm going to drop a link to them in the description so you don't have to go through all of the work I just did. But I think it's a really valuable lesson to watch through this video if you want to learn in detail how I would take these raw samples and make them into a really lush, full sounding, groovy mix-ready kit. So with that said, let's dive into it. So we're going to start by finding a kick to use for our four to the floor and then building a simple hi-hat groove on top of that. I really like to work this way of solidifying the bottom and the top end of the drum sounds because it makes it a lot easier to figure out what goes in between. The kicks and the hats are going to be your main part of the groove and usually present through most of the track, so it's a great place to start. Now, when we're picking a kick, I do just want to call out something I see with a lot of newer producers going through sample packs. I find that they spend a lot of time sometimes going through sample packs, and that is not the most efficient way to use your time. The reason I think they do that is because when they're listening to these samples, they're trying to ask this question in their head of, does this sample work? But they're hearing the sample as it is. That is not what I'm listening for when I'm choosing a sample. I'm thinking, can I turn this sample into what I want? What you're hearing is not the end. The sample is a means to the end. And I'll kind of talk that out in real time as I'm going through these. So, just as a quick example, let's go through a couple of kicks. Like this one, too hard. I don't think I want that. Right here, I hear that this is a nice soft kick. This is something I could use for minimal. Now, a lot of producers would probably be like, oh, it's super long and boomy. I don't want that like 808 style drum. But in my head, I hear this and I'm like, hey, it's got a nice sub sort of energy and it's got a nice soft top end click. Yeah, it's too long, but let's just shorten it. So I'm listening to the characteristics it has, and then I'm going to find ways to manipulate it into the sound I want. So right away, I've only gotten to the second kick, and I've already chosen something I like. I didn't have to go through 40 different kick drums, find one that I'm not that satisfied with after going through 40 of them, and then be right back at the drawing board. Making quick decisions and knowing how to work with your samples is really paramount to having an efficient workflow. So let's drop this in here. First thing we're going to do is we're going to group this to a drum rack because we're going to start building out all of our drums in here. Next thing I'm going to do is a feature in Ableton 12 that I have been really loving is you can convert all of the pads in your drum rack to this new drum sampler device. It's a little bit more straightforward than a simpler, and I really like working with drums this way for a number of reasons. We'll get into some of those as I get into the device. So let's build a new clip here, and we're just going to drop a 4 to the floor kick, and we're going to give it a listen. Not bad. Like I said, the tail of the kick is a little bit long, but we can very easily just pull down the decay. Now, you'll hear it's kind of got this weird like cutoff at the end there that sounds super artificial. One thing I love about this drum sampler device is you can take the mode from trigger to gate. This will make it so the drum sample only plays as long as whatever your MIDI note is. So check this out now. Nice and short, we can increase the decay till it's a little less artificial sounding on the cutoff. That's nice and snappy. And now this gives us the option in our MIDI grid here to actually get some note length variations without having to use any sorts of automations. For example, the last kick in the 4-bar phrase, let's just extend it. Take a listen to this. Nice subtle shift that just gives us a little bit of contrast in our 4 to the floor kick pattern. I use this gate mode on a lot of drums, and we'll really see with the hats how you can be really powerful with that. So I'm already happy with this kick. It's nice and soft and lays a nice foundation on the low end without being too hard and in your face. So let's get like a groovy hat pattern going now. We'll get to like an upbeat hi-hat next, but let's take a look through some of these samples. Now, this one is interesting here. It's got this first hit and then sort of the shake at the end. We can actually just get rid of that if we take that off, and let's convert this to a drum sampler. And let's listen to it now with just this first hit. It's this nice sort of like shakery sound. Let's see what happens if we make a 16th note pattern with this. So we're going to put the grid on 16ths. We're just going to write in every single note. You'll notice I've got a groove auto applying. I've got this swing 16th 66. It's probably going to be super swung. It might be a little bit too swung, but we'll take a look. So let's duplicate this over, and we've just got to hit on every 16th note. Now, first thing you'll notice is that the sample is just hitting the same way over and over again. They're all at the same volume. There's no dynamics here. It doesn't sound very good. But there's a lot of things we can do to shape this. So for starters, let's take the frequency of the filter down. That's a good start. And let's start getting some of these velocities to not be exactly the same. Nice trick if you're on a Mac, if you hold Command here in the MIDI grid and then hover your mouse over, you can change the velocity by clicking and dragging up and down, which is a really quick way to go through and change the velocities. On a PC, I think it's Control that you hold. So I'm just going to start sort of randomizing some of these velocities. I want the downbeats to be a little stronger and then these offbeats to be a little bit weaker. Now, on the drum sampler here, you've got this nice modulation section, and it defaults to the filter, which is what we want to use. If you bump this up, what it's going to do is say that the frequency actually will go up a little bit on the harder velocity notes, and it's going to be closer to the baseline here on the lower velocity notes. And the more you turn this up, the more it exaggerates it. Let's put it all the way up. You'll hear it sounds a little artificial and tinny, but we're going to dial it back. Already that's helping add some dynamics, and you can also exaggerate the dynamics of the volume itself with this velocity to volume control. So if we turn this up a little bit more towards like 50, let's take the filter back a bit now. We've already got this kind of shaker sound that's blending in pretty well. Now, there's more things that we can do to make this sound even less artificial and more lifelike. Shaker sounds, they don't always have this sort of like hard attack. You've noticed here the attack is all the way down. If we turn the attack a little bit up, we'll get more of that kind of swell for a shaker. Now, there's a lot of stuff I like in there, but having this on a static sound, again, just sounds as sort of robotic as it is with the attack all the way down. But we can use an expression control to map the velocity to any parameter on any of your devices. I've been using this all the time lately, especially on drums. If you take this and map it to the attack, and then dial it back to taste, notice how every hit now has a slightly different attack. Basically, this drum sampler has velocity to volume built in, velocity to filter built in, but anything else you want to map the velocity to, you can make up that gap with the expression control. And we can even drop another one in, and let's map this to the sample start. So now it's not going to play the whole sample. It'll take these kind of randomized transients towards the beginning of the sample and give us even more variation in the way the sample is played back. Let's actually turn this on remote mode so we can see where it's starting. We kind of have to use this curve option to get it to respond. Cool. So nice subtle variations. This is starting to sound like a pretty usable top-end hi-hat part. Let's find a upbeat hi-hat to go with this, and then we're going to start shaping the groove to make sure that these hats are playing nicely together. So we're going to go back to our packs. We're going to start searching for more hi-hats. A lot of these very artificial sounding. We're going to look for something that has more of a sort of just, natural feel to it. I like this one here, so let's drop this in. Let's also name our drums as we go so that we don't get confused, because we're going to end up with a lot of drum samples here. We'll call this shaker hat. This one hi-hat closed is fine. We'll turn it to a drum sampler. And in the MIDI grid here, we're just going to put this on every upbeat note. So any of the notes that say 0.3 at the end here in our 1-bar loop. Now, again, turning this trigger mode to gate can be really useful because we can make these short, snappy hats, and then some of them we can extend the length out, and it's going to give us some variation. We can even kind of make them all a little bit different. We'll make the last one, we'll keep it long. Not bad. And let's do some of the same things we did on the shaker with the velocity modulation. So we'll dial the filter back a little bit. And we'll randomize the velocities just a tad on some of these. Nice, so we've already got some nice dynamics coming out of this. Let's play with the decay. Now you can hear this first note, it's really short now. We can actually use that in a different pattern if we want, but for now we're going to keep it longer. Now, one thing I'm always a little conflicted on when I do these 16th note patterns is it sitting in the background enough to get out of the way of the main hat? Something I often try, which we'll give a shot right now, is just muting the hits where another hi-hat is playing. There are other ways to go about this. You can use the choke on the drum rack. In this case, I don't want to deal with that. Let's just see how it sounds when we get that shaker out of the way. Sounds great. So we're going to keep running with this, and we're keeping all of these samples kind of raw right now. Once we get our groove together a little bit more with some claps and percussions, then we're going to start adding some effects to these sounds and make them sound a little more production and mix ready. All right, so next we're going to find an open hi-hat sound so that we can drive a little more energy in the groove. Let's name our clip here intro groove, and we're going to duplicate that, and then we're going to say open hat. This clip is going to have an open hat that brings up the energy a little bit, and we're going to try and find something that, again, has kind of an organic sound. Some of these are very artificial, but these analog ones tend to be a little bit better. I like this one here. It's not too open. It's like half open. Let's give that a shot. We'll convert it to drum sampler, and what we're going to do is move our closed hat up to the open hat. Quick trick if you don't know about this, you click a key on the piano roll here, it automatically highlights all the drums in that row and you can move them up and down from there. Nice little shortcut. So let's give that a listen. That already sounds pretty good. We can do some minimal processing. Get the frequency filter. Just very slight variations, not even that perceptible, but little things go a long way. And then let's use our closed hat that we had to start adding some little hi-hat accents. Now, what I usually do with this is I'll pick one of the 16th notes either before or after the open hat and get these sort of little hi-hat kind of flourishes going. So let's try putting one right here. We're going to keep the velocities really low on these because they're just these little accent ghost notes. I already like that. If we add another one before the last open hat, I think that'll sound good too, but since we only have a 1-bar loop, it might be a little repetitive. We'll see if we want to duplicate it and change some things up. And let's make these nice and short just in case. And here, let's duplicate this. So we'll leave this out right here, and we'll have it just happen on the end of the 2-bar loop. Nice, so that's pretty groovy. What I did was we just have this one hi-hat accent in the first bar, and then the second bar, I added the accent before the open hat, and then another before the last open hat, and then a stronger one on the very last 16th note, which gives us that kind of signifying this is the end of the loop and it's going to the next section. So now that we've got an open hat, let's get a clap going. And again, a lot of these sample packs are going to have really like harsh clap sounds. In minimal, we almost don't need like a big bold clap. We just kind of want something to lock in the groove on the 2 and the 4, and we can keep it really soft and reserved. So let's see what's in here. I actually kind of like this one, and it's a little long for my taste. We're gonna make this shorter, so let's see how snappy and short we can get this. We're gonna turn it on gate mode, and then we're gonna go to our clip. Let's duplicate actually another clip. We'll call this one clap. And let's get a clap going on the 2 and the 4. Already sounds pretty good, but as I said, it's got a lot of tail. I think that we can take this down considerably, and let's move the start in a little bit too to get rid of that harsh transient. I want something that's a little bit more subdued and soft. I actually really like that it closes super fast. It's just a little present in the mix, so let's roll back the frequency on the filter a bit. There we go. That's that nice kind of minimal sound. It took me a while to realize, like, minimal house and micro house, it literally means like the samples are tiny. Making things really short is kind of a cornerstone of being micro house. You want to think literally, like, make your samples as small as they can possibly be, and that usually will end up with a good result. So let's just get this mixed a little bit. I think it might be a touch loud. We'll turn it down a decibel, maybe 2. Yeah, we don't need the clap super in your face. Nice. We've already got a pretty good groove going. Sounds a little bit raw. We're going to add some percussions and little flourishes, and then we're going to do just a little bit of sound design on these drums, and I think we're going to have ourselves a nice full kit. So as far as flourishes go, there's a lot of different directions that we can take this. The first thing that I hear in my head is that some variations on the claps would be cool, but we should do that with another drum sample, and I think a snare is a good route to go with this. So let's find a cool snare. I kind of like this one. It's got a weird resonance to it. We'll see how it works. I'm going to have to tame it somewhere, but we'll give it a shot. Now we're going to add this just on these little off notes here and there. Let's try like 2 notes right here. Let's keep the velocities kind of low. I like that. I think we'd even add more, honestly. Maybe take that one out. Cool. Now, this sound has a lot going on in the bottom end. What we're going to do is we're actually going to change our filter around to cut the lows instead of the highs, and we just want some of the high end of that. So we'll set the cutoff at like 400 or so. Nice. That's a little more subdued. And let's find ourselves another snare that we can use at the end of the bar to do another little flourish. I actually like this one. It's got that kind of classic 808 sound. Let's see how that sounds if we just add a little rolls at the end right here. Pretty cool. Let's do the same thing too, where we're gonna take the lows off of this sound and just get some of that boominess out of there. So we'll change this to the high pass filter, put it up around 400. Nice. We can even take this down a little bit. Maybe more around like 150. Pretty cool, and this is a good opportunity again to use our velocity and filter combination because we can make it so the harder hits have a little bit more low end presence. Actually, we want to go negative to give it more low end presence. Awesome. And as I start to build out these clips, you'll notice that making them longer gives us more room to give variations without sounding so loopy and exhausting the listener. So I'm going to duplicate this again, get rid of that little snare fill, and now it's just only at the end of 4 bars. Perfect. We got ourselves a nice groove going here. Now let's get some percussive sounds that we can make some textures with. Let's take a look at what they've got in here. Miscellaneous percussion. No idea what's in this folder, but we're going to find something to work with. Oh, I like this. Again, we're going to be looking for sort of off beats. Something like this might sound good on a downbeat, but we're just going to play around and see where in the groove this fits. Let's try one towards the beginning. I actually kind of hear that right here. That's pretty cool, and it's got some low end presence that I want to roll off, so we're going to take this filter, just push it up. Awesome, and it's also a little long for my taste. We can take the hold down. Nice. Let's get a couple more of these going. I actually think I like this thing. Now, it's really long, and there's a lot of different directions we could go with this. This would actually be a pretty good sample to just run through like a ton of reverb and maybe use it kind of in place of a crash cymbal, like on the start of a phrase. I'm going to go somewhere different with this. And I'm going to turn an expression control to the sample start. So that way we can use the velocity to get different points within the sample to trigger. So let's put this here and let's see what happens. Let's make a new clip just to experiment with this. We're going to try some different velocities around this sample and see what happens. Right off the bat, that actually makes like kind of an interesting texture. Oh, I kind of love that. If we add another expression control to the attack, that is a really cool kind of rolling texture that we can use throughout the entire piece if we want to. This is a good example where I think we stumbled upon a sound that, yes, it's in the drum kit, and that's how we found it. I probably wouldn't really mix this as a drum. What I think we should do is just take all of this right here. Let's cut it. Let's create a new MIDI track. We'll call this texture. Let's paste these in here. And then let's get this MIDI clip over here. Let's change the color. And now we've got a texture to work with on a new track. We just have to make sure it's on the right MIDI note. It's got to go up to C3. Awesome. So now we have this texture to go underneath what we've already got. Blend this a bit. I also notice it's coming out really far on the right side. I want it to be a little more in the center. We can drop a utility on this and just put it in mono for now. Cool. So fun little detour that was. Sometimes you find something when you're going to make drums that turn into something else. Let's get back to finding some more snappy percussive elements that we can use. So back to our pack here. Let's try this thing. It's got kind of like this like metal hit sound. We'll play with the start time. and the decay. And let's turn this on gate mode. We can play with some different note lengths. That's pretty cool. Let's move some of these even off the grid a little bit. Give them a little kind of just off-kilter feel. Now, I'm going to experiment a little bit here. I think that's a pretty cool kind of percussive hook as it is, but I'm thinking maybe we can make the pitch work in some ways that makes it just a little bit more variant. Yeah, so let's try this. We're going to take an expression control. We're going to map it to the pitch. Let's turn it on remote mode so we can see what it's doing. And yeah, we definitely don't want it going down 47 semitones, that's for sure. Get this up to 50%, and we're just gonna have it go between like a few ranges of pitch, maybe a semitone or two. So now if I make this a higher velocity, it should go from its original pitch and then maybe up one semitone. Seems like they're all up one semitone. Let's take this down. There we go. That's what I wanted. Let's have this one go up too. And let's keep this one flat. Cool. Just a little bit of pitch variation makes things a little more interesting, a little less samey. So back to the packs. Let's get a couple more layers going here. This one's fun. I've got an idea for this. We're gonna turn this to a drum sampler again. One thing I really like in the drum sampler, it's got this effects section. Some of them can be really interesting. The one it defaults to stretch. You can actually do some pretty wild things with this. You turn it up. Here it gets this like roll, but you can turn the grain down. Almost kind of sounds like a delay. What we should do is map an expression control to this, and we're going to create a drum roll where the grain starts super short and then gets longer as the velocity goes up. So we'll map this to the grain time, and I'm playing on my move over here where I can control the velocities a little bit. Let's write something in towards the end here. So we're going to start with these very low velocity notes, going to have the short grain. And if we duplicate this over just on the last bar, you can highlight these, and in the MIDI control, you have this ramp option here at the bottom. If you turn up the second one, you can ramp the velocity of these MIDI notes up. So let's see what that sounds like. I actually think we should do this with the opposite kind of ramp. So let's have it end short and start long. And then we're gonna just blend this in the background a bit because right now this is a little bit too in your face. Cool. So let's have the filter also open up as these sounds get softer. That way these initial hits won't be so present. So we're going to turn this down and we're going to here actually we don't need to turn it down that much. If we turn this negative, then these higher velocity hits will have the filter play down here and then it'll open up as the velocities get softer. And this is something I would maybe do at the end of an 8-bar phrase. We can even mix up the rhythms just a little bit so that it's not so right on the grid. Let's get just a little bit of syncopation going like this, and let's just listen to this as a little 2-bar loop. That is pretty cool. The only thing I really want to get rid of with another effect here is there's some boominess in the low end because I turned up the res on the filter, but we just want to cut off some of those lows. I really just want the high end of the sound. Yeah, I can see it's this resonance here I don't really like. Awesome. So let's listen to our whole 8-bar loop. I think there's even more percussion we can add here, but we're getting pretty close to like a pretty full lush loop without even having done any effects processing yet. That is pretty cool. This already sounds like an intro that I would run with for like a minimal track. So next we're going to see if we can get some sounds that just add a little bit more variation in these 8 bars. What I'm going to do here is actually create another MIDI track, and we're going to call this percussive fills. Now, I like to try and keep my drum rack to mostly kind of foundational elements, and when I'm going through and actually doing my arrangement, it can start to become a pain to go in here and make all these different variations and have like a million different drum clips. If we create a separate track with just a few samples on a drum rack, then it's a little easier to make variations of just these more top end fills. So we're expanding this out to another drum rack now. Back to our packs and find this could be good. Now, the goal with these is to make them a little bit less sort of hypnotic and on a rolling rhythm, and we want them to be a little bit more like these one-shots that come in at different times that are a little unexpected and just give a little more intrigue to the listener. Let's cut off the lows on this. And let's give this a little bit of stretch. That's cool. All right, and we're gonna find somewhere in like a 2-bar loop to put this. Try an off note here. That's cool. Let's make this 4 bars now because I don't want this to play again too soon. We're just gonna keep finding other little percussions to put on some of these offbeats. This one I couldn't even hear. That's cool. Let's get a couple more to mix it up with. pretty cool. Let's take the grain time down on this first one. Now the sample has a lot going on. We're gonna take just one of the hits out of this by adjusting the start and the end. Cool, now it's just like this little percussion hit, and we can drop that with a little roll at the end. Let's put it somewhere we can hear it better. And let's pitch it up. Nice. Take the filter down a bit. And last thing I notice here is this sounds that we're using. I don't like the pitch it's at. I want it to be pitched up. That sounds better. Yeah, and like I said, this is great to have a rack of just these sort of like effects percussions, because now we can take this clip and we can duplicate it, we can create new ones, we can do, this is just one pattern we can use throughout our track, and we don't have to keep using this as a loop. So let's do some light processing on these drums, just make them sound a little more full, a little more glued together. I'm gonna turn off our percussive fills for now, and we're gonna focus on some effects processing here in the drum kit. So first thing I want to do is add some saturation to the entire drum kit. This is just going to help sort of emulate that analog feel. There are a lot of VSTs that I would go to for this as well, but Ableton's stock saturator is actually pretty good now that I've learned how to work it a little bit. If you turn up the drive on this, it's going to make things a little more crunchy, but also really loud, and we can offset that with the output knob. So let's start there. Let's do a quick A-B. Not super noticeable, but a little transparent. We can make this a little bit more noticeable and get more of that sort of tape feel. Let's put this on Wave Shapers, different saturation algorithm. Now, that's really in your face, but we can do things to tame this a little bit. It took me years until I realized Saturator has a drop-down menu, and it actually has an EQ on it. If you turn the low down, you get rid of that like really harsh tape saturation, and then we can saturate the highs a little bit more. Let's turn up the width. This just a little bit. Nice. That's got that kind of old tape machine feel now. Next thing I want to do is add some wet effects, namely reverb and delay. I really like doing this in the drum rack with the dry wet. If you click this little hamburger menu button over here, you get this R and this S. If you hit R, you can drop a return effect here. I really am not a fan of Ableton's stock reverb, but I do really like their convolution reverb. So let's drop one of those on here. Now, after you drop your return effect in, you then have to hit this little S, and it gives you volumes to send to your return device. So we're going to start with maybe just some of the hi-hats and get them going through this convolution reverb. We're going to want something with a pretty short decay and a somewhat smaller size, maybe a little bit of pre-delay just to add a slight slapback effect. And it's got all sorts of algorithms. Let's start with like one of these ambients in small rooms. I don't want something that's going to be too present, and there's a trillion options to go through here. We're just going to find something we like and run with it. So if I hit solo on this, we won't hear anything, but we can start sending in. Let's get our clap. Let's turn off the texture as well. That's some nice natural sounding reverb. And let's hear it in the mix. Now let's dial back this saturator a little bit on the highs. And we can A/B that a little. Might be a little hot, we can turn the reverb down. We want it to be really subtle in the mix, and then there's also EQ controls here on the convolution. You usually don't want the lows coming through too much, and if you tame the highs a little bit, just gives a bit of a darker sound. Oh, and we want dry wet to be at 100%. We don't want any bleed over with the dry sound. Awesome. That gives us just a little bit of presence, and we can add that on some of our effects that we're using as well, or these like percussive effects hits. So we've got perk 3, perk 4. And the snare. All right, cool. So let's get some delay going too. I'm always a little torn if I want to use the delay or the echo. They're both really good. They have sorts of different uses. I'm going to go with the delay in this case. It's a little more plain sounding. It just kind of echoes back the sound that you put into it exactly as it is. The echo has all these sort of tape artifacts, which I think are awesome a lot of the time. But in this case, we just want a more subtle kind of delay. We don't need the delay to have too much presence. So let's turn dry wet to 100, the feedback down to like 15 to 20, and we're going to use the filter to cut off the lows and the highs. We can keep it here on 3/16 notes, and it's just going to be a nice subtle effect on some of the hats, maybe the clap. We forgot to put reverb on our shaker sound too. Now, that's going to get really hot on the open hat, but I think it might sound okay with just a smidge of it on the closed hat. This is sounding pretty good. Now, the next thing I would do to really solidify this is like a fully mixed drum kit is mess with the panning a little bit. Very subtle panning can go a long way. For example, like this 808 snare, let's just put it like 7 to the right. Let's see what else we used in here. We have this other kind of roll snare. We'll put it also on the right, just to 3. The hats we can pan just a little bit. We'll put the open like 3 to the left and the close maybe like 7 to the left. And then some of these more one-shot kind of percussion sounds, we either can pan those on the drum rack, or we can also drop in the auto pan and get them to move around. Yeah, like this one that comes in at that fill at the end, I think this is a good one to auto pan. We'll keep it pretty subtle, and we want it to be kind of slow. Let's hear how that sounds. Yeah, that's cool. And then this one, we'll do something similar. Let's change this to a triangle, take the amount down a bit and the frequency down a little bit. Cool. So we've got our drums fully saturated, some reverb for a more realistic kind of space, and delay just to fill out a little bit of the extra space. We're going to call it here on this lesson. You can see that we barely even scratched the surface of the sample pack that Ableton gave us. I'm going to do more videos just going through this sample pack. I really want to focus on things that we all have access to as Ableton users and not have to use any external samples. Hope you learned a lot from this video. If you have any questions or any requests for future videos, please drop them in the comments below. See ya.